I'd like to call this briefing to order. This briefing of the Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order at 10:06 in the morning. Unfortunately, our chairwoman, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, is unable to be in Washington this week. She is at her family's side. Her mother is in failing health from complications with Alzheimer's, and so I would ask that we all remember she and her mother and her family in this very troubled time. It's very difficult to lose a loved one, especially a parent. And Ileana asked me to chair this briefing, and I was very gracious and happy to accept. I will now recognize myself for 7 minutes to read the chairman's opening statement, which should be considered attributable to her. As I said, this is her statement, this committee's last hearing on the United Nations reform, quote, with significant leadership by the United States, the United Nations was founded on high ideals. Quote, the pursuit of international peace and development and the promotion of basic human rights are core, historic concerns of American people. At its best, the UN can play an important role in promoting U.S. interests and international security, but reality hasn't matched the ideals. End quote. According to the United States policy on the United Nations, should be based on three fundamental questions. Are we advancing the American interests? Are we upholding American values? Are we being responsible stewards for the American taxpayer dollars? Unfortunately, right now, the answer to all three questions is no. Here's the simple math. With no strings attached, we pay all contributions that the United Nations assesses to us, 20% of their annual budget, plus billions more every year. According to the OMB, the fiscal year 2009, the U.S. contributed well over $6 billion to the UN at a time of high unemployment, skyrocketing deficits, crushing debt, and other great economic and fiscal challenges to our nation. And what have we gotten in return from the UN? Well, here are a few examples. The UN Development Program fired a whistleblower who revealed that the United Nations Development Program's office in North Korea was not being managed properly and was being exploited by Kim Jong-il's regime. In 2008, a Senate subcommittee found that the UN Development Program's local staff was selected by the regime, and the UNDP paid the staff salaries directly to the regime in foreign currency with no way to know whether the funds weren't being diverted to enrich the regime. The UNDP prevented proper oversight and undermined whistleblower protections by limiting access to its audits and refusing to submit to the UN's Ethics Office jurisdiction. The regime used its relationship with the UNDP to move money outside North Korea, and the UNDP transferred funds to a company tied to an entity designated by the U.S. as North Korea's financial agent for weapons sales. The UNDP briefly pulled out of North Korea, but now they're back, and this time they can select staff from a list of 3 candidates handpicked by the regime, not just one. That's what passes for reform in the UN. The U.S. taxpayers are also paying 1/5 of the bills for the UN's anti-Israeli activities, including the UN Human Rights Council, a rogues gallery dominated by human rights violators who use it to ignore real abuses and instead attack democratic Israel relentlessly. The Council was also the fountainhead for the infamous Durban II conference and the Goldstone report. One more example. An independent procurement task force uncovered cases of corruption tainting hundreds of millions of dollars in UN contracts. In response, the UN shut down the task force. When the head of the UN's Oversight Office tried to hire the chairman of the task force, former U.S. Prosecutor Robert Appleton, as the top investigator, the UN Secretary General blocked it. Well, the UN may not want him. Well, we're pleased to have Mr. Appleton here today. Ironically, the UN's current chief investigator, who has reportedly failed to pursue cases, is now under investigation himself for retaliating against whistleblowers. Ambassador Susan Rice says the U.S.'s approach to the UN is, quote, "We pay our bills, we push for real reform," end quote. Instead, we should be conditioning our contributions on reform first, pay later. In the past, Congress has gone along by willingly paying what successive administrations asked for without enough oversight. This is one of the first true UN reform hearings held by this committee in almost 4 years, but it won't be the last. Right now, the vast majority of countries at the UN General Assembly pay next to nothing in assessed contributions, creating a pervasive incentive because those who make decisions don't have to pay the bills. So, I, meaning Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, am going to reintroduce legislation that conditions our contributions, our strongest leverage on real, sweeping reform, including moving the UN regular budget to a voluntary funding basis. That way, U.S. taxpayers can pay for the UN programs and activities that advance our interests and our values. And if other countries want different things to be funded, they can pay for it themselves. This will encourage competition, competence, and effectiveness. The voluntary model works for UNICEF and many other UN agencies, and it can work for the UN as a whole. One more point. Some of the UN's defenders like to cite some good UN activities to gain support for funding bad ones. However, we're not here to play let's make a deal with hard-earned U.S. taxpayer dollars. Each UN office, activity, program, and subprogram, country by country and function by function, must be justified on its own merits. UNICEF programs to help starving children cannot excuse the United Nations Relief and Work Agencies having members of Hamas on its payroll. The World Health Organization's vaccination programs cannot excuse the Human Rights Council biased actions. My colleagues, reforming the UN should not be a Republican or Democratic issue. It is in the interest of all Americans. And so I hope and trust that the UN reform efforts will be strongly bipartisan. That concludes the chairwoman's opening remarks.